Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, there's a particular topic I want to focus on for today's solo flight special. We know that on past episodes, my first officer, Jeremy Graventon, and I have oftentimes mentioned that perception in politics often matters more than facts and reality on the ground. This has just been an integral part of the American system of polity going back to the inception of this country. And what it relates to is the fact that, in a sense, politics, by its very nature, at least in the American system, has to be based off of an adversarial system. So you need a bit of theatrics in order to be able to vet the candidates, to determine what their differences and distinguishments are, so that you can then make an educated determination as to whom you believe is qualified or not to wield the reins of political power. That is part of a representative republic. It is also what was so revolutionary about our entire system of polity. Because when you think back to the 18th century, when our nation was founded, sovereignty, as I've explained on past solo flight special editions, was constrained to one entity or individual or a small group, basically an oligarchy or an aristocracy. These things were fundamentally rejected by our founding fathers, and they took the revolutionary approach that the absolute wielders of supreme sovereignty was none other than we the people. And that is why we have a representative republic. It's also why we have a system like the Electoral College, to ensure that not one group, due to size of population alone, can dominate the entire message of polity. Despite this, we still have certain controlling areas with states and certain populations that can dominate the entire electoral scale, meaning that it can determine who becomes president or not. But going back to the whole notion of perception, this 2016 presidential election cycle has been one of the most unique. And that's because this cycle has been one of the most vicious, contentious, heated, personalized contests or fights in living memory. We have seen candidates get down in the mud, hurling ad hominem attack after ad hominem attack at one another, and this all creates a certain perception. And that perception, with respect to the gutless opposition party or GOP frontrunner, New York billionaire, businessman, real estate tycoon, and all-around vulgarian Donald J. Trump, is that he refuses to back down from anything, that he's a political outsider. Of course, the whole notion about that is laughable, because he's about to turn 70, and he's been involved with politics all throughout his adult life, even by his own admission. If you stop and think about it, when he's greased the palms of politicians going back to his entrance into the New York real estate world, that is a form of politics. But the way that the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media has construed this story and has painted this story, one would think that he is a political outsider, because that is the narrative. It is the narrative that they have doubled down on, and it is the narrative that they expect you to buy hook, line, and sinker. But there's more to it than that. There really is more to the entire incident and the entire spectrum of what is occurring in American polity right now than Donald Trump is some magical outsider that is going to, through sheer willpower, conjure up the conditions that will ensure the safety and preservation of America. If it sounds a bit like a fairy tale, it's because it is. It's a bunch of bunk. It's hogwash. And literally what it comes down to is that Donald Trump has espoused, for the vast majority of his adult life, the very liberal, progressive points of view that we are all so drastically opposed to. And that raises a significant question here. It's what has caused a perception shift to such an extent that it causes people to disregard facts, to rawly emote, thereby allowing themselves to be more easily manipulated by someone who is seeking to do nothing short of that. Well, it comes down to, firstly, we have the two disastrous terms of this Barack Hussein Obama regime that has worked tirelessly to fundamentally transform this representative republic of ours to some Fabian socialist dystopia. The point that the gutless opposition party, led by the detente wing, or what is colloquially referred to as the establishment wing, has added fuel to that fire, because they have not once stood up to the onslaught of Obama's efforts to fundamentally transform the office of president into nothing short than a position of a dictator in a banana republic. We are about 2 steps away from having something like that here in the United States. Think back to his comments about, I've got a telephone and a pen, and I'm going to use them. All about sidestepping the people's branch of government, which is none other than the legislative branch of government. The reason that's the people's branch is because we elect the representatives. They are there to represent us. That is the way that our system was designed. And we see that these attempts to further divorce the United States system of government away from the clear and concise language contained within the 4 corners of our Constitution has led to create this system that is diametrically opposed to the best interests of the American people. And this is by design, folks. The Fabian socialists have been working tirelessly and incessantly towards this goal for well over a century now. And they think that they have gotten so good at it, and that they have progressed so far that they see a light at the end of the tunnel, and they think that that is their ultimate success. That they will change the United States of America from a representative republic into some Fabian socialist dystopia that is not only contrary to the clear and concise language of our Constitution, but is diametrically opposed to the fundamental and inalienable rights that are endowed to each of us as citizens. You see, folks, this is the danger that we must face. And we must have a practicable and real-world solution to it. But the interesting thing is, we don't have to look far to find that solution. The key is the Constitution, and that has been with us since the very start of this country over 230 years ago. But we have been led astray to forget what our rights and powers and abilities are as popular sovereigns. And we see that in education, we see it in the news media, and we see it in the annals of government. And that is the danger that prohibits us from actually finding a solution. Going back to this notion of perception, there is a perception that has been created by the incessant efforts of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media that all of a sudden the American people are helpless. This ties in line with the Cloward-Priven principle, devised by a couple of socialist academicians who wanted to overpower the system, overburden the system, so that they could then force the people to come to the government on bended knee and beg for the very source that created the problem to propose and proffer solutions. Now, folks, if that sounds dubious and devious, it is because it is by design to unravel an existing system. They create the perception that there is no way to overcome the great burdens that face the nation without top-down centralized control from the federal government. But when you stop and compare that to the true tenets of federalism as laid out by our Constitution, you find that that is the direct opposite, the exact opposite of the way that our founding fathers intended for this nation to run and intended for our system of polity to operate. Because, again, when you look at the natural law tenets that underpin this entire system, absolute sovereignty rests solely on the shoulders of the American people. We delegate certain authority to the state governments, who then delegate certain authority to the federal government. And this is all contained within the greatest social compact or contract ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above. That contract, our Constitution, not only states what rights are there, what our fundamental and inalienable rights are, but it dictates the manner in which government may operate, and it restricts the ability of the government to encroach upon our fundamental and inalienable rights. Because of that natural law doctrine that was understood innately by George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, they all understood that our fundamental and inalienable rights were endowed to us by our Creator, meaning that no earthly, legitimate authority could abridge, belittle, besmirch, take away those rights without first going through an operation known as due process under the law. And that means notice in a hearing and having the chance to face your accusers, and it has to be formalized and it has to be adjudicated. Why? Because it's important to remember that those rights are God-given. And the only way that they can be taken away is if we act in such a fashion as to encroach upon the rights and liberties and freedoms of our fellow sovereign individual. Because our rights end where another person's rights begins, but it still needs to be proven because the rights are so important. They're more important than the governmental structure itself. And again, this is all contained within the natural law structure that states that government starts with the family, moves to the municipalities or cities, to the counties, to the states, to the federal government. In a sense, you could call it a pecking order, because that's what it is. And our founding fathers felt that the further you got away from the people, the less reliable that type of government was, the less power that type of government should have. And it's amazing because they understood the timeless nature of it. And that's why you see in Article 5 of the Constitution that they provided us with an avenue by which we could amend the Constitution. But the problem is, this isn't discussed much in public anymore. It's not part of the marketplace of ideals that's discussed in our systems and institutions of education. Instead, we learn to praise socialists who have nothing but our utter destruction as their objective, and we learn just how unfair the system is. But again, that comes back to being nothing more than an erroneous perception, a deceitful perception peddled by those who wish to control and dominate the flow and marketplace of ideas in the United States. And they want to dominate it so that they can transform us, to destroy what exists, to replace it with what they think is the best system, the system best suited to fulfill the needs of the people. But the problem is, history has shown time and again that socialism, wherever it's tried, fails. It's a failed ideology, and it certainly has no place in an open and honest society like that of the United States. But then we see the case of Donald Trump. Following in the immediate aftermath of Barack Hussein Obama, the people are so tired, they're so distraught, wondering what has happened to their nation, that they're practically willing to turn to any strongman to find a solution for the country. They have bought into another false and erroneous perception that a strong man can save this country, that an individual or a singular entity can save this country. But that's not the case. Go back to the design of the United States. Go back to the opening lines, to the preamble to the United States Constitution, and you find the answer of the only ones who can save the country. We, the people. After all, it was we, the people, who created the United States, and therefore it can only be we, the people, that corrects the problems, that returns the United States back to prosperity. We are the only ones endowed with the authority and the ability to legitimately do so. That has been the design of the United States stretching back over 230 years. And to depart from that design would be to further increase the problems that we're facing as a nation. It would be to further distance ourselves from the proper solution. You see, folks, as always, the Constitution is the key. The Constitution gives us the leverage and power to tell government no. It prevents the chains and shackles of governmental tyranny, bondage, and ultimately servitude from controlling our lives and every facet of our daily lives. But one of the things I've heard lamented about from friends of my own is that, well, the Constitution's not doing a good job of protecting us. What they're forgetting is that there is a give and take with this. The Constitution can only protect us when we are proactively protecting it. You see, it's part of that bifurcated relationship, or that two-parted relationship that is created by that contract, which is the Constitution. And from that, we are endowed with the power to save this country, and only we are endowed with that. Not any of the candidates, not the government, not any of it. Only we, the people, as popular sovereigns, going back to that natural law aspect. You see, those are the facts. They're more powerful than the perceptions, but the perceptions have been used to blackmail the American people. They have been used to brainwash us, to forget what's important. And Donald Trump is exploiting the anger that has erupted from that, which in turn leads us to another dangerous area. When you are willing to sacrifice your fundamental and inalienable rights for a false sense of security, Benjamin Franklin warns us that you deserve neither, and you will certainly have none. That is such a poignant remark, And it's fitting, because when you give up your liberties for a false sense of security, what are you sacrificing? You are sacrificing your fundamental and inalienable rights for a false perception. Yes, the truth always has a way of shining through. It has no agenda. It always comes through in the end, and it is what sets us free. And the self-evident truths of our Constitution can and will and must shine through again. But we must recall that the perception that is being peddled by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media is all designed to weaken us. And then you have Donald Trump, who spews out so many perceptions at once. A, you can't figure out who he is. B, he invites his people or his followers to project their own hopes, dreams, and aspirations upon him, meaning that in the end, if anything should happen to cause that to collapse, they would be despondent and without hope. And thirdly, the way that he has engaged in this is convincing people that he is something which he is not. But the hints are there. If you read between the lines, you can find in his own words where he says that it's a perception. His own campaign spokesperson or campaign fixer, Paul Manafort, had a taped meeting with the detente wing of the gutless opposition party, or at least the leaders of it, in which he proclaimed that the most vicious positions that Donald Trump has taken, or the most outlandish positions that Trump has taken, is nothing more than a caricature. It's a projection. It's a shadow. It's a farce. It's a perception. It's a false flag designed to draw in the base that he's attempting to appeal to cause them to emote and to shut down their mental faculties so that they simply accept him for being something which he is not. And there is a real danger to that, because people are so whipped up into a frenzy. It is almost to the point where mob mentality, with a sense of paranoia and a complete disconnect from reality, is threatening to take this country over completely. But it can all be stopped. It can all be reversed when you recall that we are inherently endowed by our Creator with fundamental and inalienable rights. And the most important thing to recall about all of that is that those fundamental and inalienable rights form what is known as popular sovereignty. Absolute power of government comes from us, and government is only legitimate when it is government by consent. You see, this has its roots all the way back to Runnymede in 1215 with the Magna Carta, as I have mentioned on a past Solo Flight special. You see, it's all interrelated. It's all interconnected. But there are those nefarious forces that would stop at nothing to deprive us of this. There are those forces that would use these false perceptions to keep us down, to enslave us to government. And they will never stop. They will never back down from what they try to accomplish, which is the utter destruction of the longest running contiguous constitutional document in all of world history. Why? Because they want power. Power. And you see, the tool of power, the tool of manipulation, is The power of perception. The use of perception to ensnare people. It's why P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute, when he would have them go to his circus sideshows, where he would have the freaks and present all of this fabricated stuff as reality. He used perception. He used theatrics. There's a difference between mere theatrics and deceitful theatrics. Remember, I said at the opening that politics is theatrical. It has to be, in order for us to vet out the candidates, to distinguish how they are different from one another. But it was not meant, at least in a virtuous system, to be manipulative, to be deceitful. But that's what Donald Trump peddles in. He says he was a warrior against the cancerous, venomous doctrine of political correctness. Yet on the issue of transgender restrooms, he wholeheartedly sides with political correctness. Caitlyn Jenner, he said, could use any bathroom in Trump Tower. And then Caitlyn Jenner did so and raised a glass and toast. Now, already I know that some of the trumpeters are going to come out here and say, but Randy, New York City ordinance requires that. Well, yes. New York City is run by Bill de Blasio, a man who is nothing short of a communist, a man who, by the way, Donald Trump donated to. Just like Donald Trump back in 2009 and as recently up to 2014, but 2009 with Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, who now wants to allow convicted felons to be able to vote. He gave him he gave him $25,000 to give Virginia. But he's an outsider. He's not a politician. And he's going to make America great again. But why do we never ask, how is he going to make America great again when he gives so much more on the scale to these radical, frothing at the mouth, Fabian socialist left-wingers, when he himself comes out and says that the conservative movement should remove the abortion plank or should change it, we should alter our positions because it's too radical or whatever. That's not going to make our country great. First of all, our country never stopped being great in the first place. Our country is great because of the Constitution. And that Constitution is still in place. Remember what we said, that the Constitution is the key to resolving all of these issues and problems that face the country. But we have to believe in it. We have to break through these false perceptions which are clouding our judgment and pitting American citizen against American citizen. And there's so much danger in that. Because right now, due to all the vitriol that has been flung out throughout this primary campaign season, the gutless opposition party, or GOP's base, is hopelessly divided. Hopelessly divided. This, when we're facing an opponent, it's looking more and more likely to be Hillary Clinton, who is a disaster waiting to happen. This should have been our election to win. But instead, we have a charlatan who used a deceitful perception to con the base of the party. He manipulated their anger, their righteous anger. There can be no question that the anger that is felt towards the establishment and towards the political powers that be is legitimate. But instead of harnessing that for creative energy to say, look, Hillary Clinton's over there, attack, he unleashed it on his fellow Republicans. Why? Because ultimately he himself does not abide by a conservative point of view. He himself embraces the same type of Fabian socialist machinations that his opponent does. That is the real danger. You see, Donald Trump is a master of perception. He has utilized perception all throughout this 2016 primary season thus far. If you think back to the way that he was able to cast El Jefe, Jeb A. Bush, as a low-energy candidate, that has its roots in an attempt to create a false perception. Irrespective of what you think of El Jefe, you know we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, didn't think much of him, thought he was a detente member. In fact, he is a detente member. But that whole notion of low energy, that hounded him. It hounded him until the end. The same thing with Little Marco, and then Lion Ted. All of these nasty, vicious ad hominem attacks are actually done to create a false perception. It's a narrative. You see, Trump is trying to control the narrative, and he's learned how to use social media to accomplish that goal. So he works at it relentlessly. And the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media have fallen in line for it. They perpetuate these myths, and that allows a false narrative to be created. But I think the most shocking part of the false perception narrative that has been thrust upon the American electorate has been done by the part of members of the so-called conservative media. Those who are not part of the salivating mainstream media. I'm talking Matt Drudge, the Drudge Report, Breitbart News, Michael Savage, Ann Coulter, Sean Hannity. You see, those individuals used to harp about how it was a bad thing to have mass mentality created, or mob mentality created by a false mainstream media narrative. And they spoke about the propagandistic methods and agenda of the mainstream media being levied against conservative candidates, meaning that anytime we do enter into an election cycle, we are always at a disadvantage. And there used to be a partnership, and there still sort of is, between the detente wing of the gutless opposition party, or GOP, and the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. They're both pushing for increased government control, increased government autonomy, as opposed to increased freedom for the American people. You see, the reason that we have a free press, the guarantee of a free press from the First Amendment, was that the press was supposed to be the watchdog of liberty. It was supposed to be there to shield the American people, to help them vet out the frauds who were just there to try and sow the seeds of tyranny and despotism in the heart of our representative republic. But somewhere along the way, starting with the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst, around the turn of the 20th century, that mission, that objective, that purpose of the media was lost. They became a champion for the big government types. They began pushing for absolute government control. That doesn't work, except in so much as it creates the false perception narrative. If you think back in history, the idea of a false narrative created by an deceitful perception created by slanted reporting. Think back to how Dan Quayle was lambasted for spelling potato with an E. You see, they created the perception that he was an idiot, and they harped on that perception over and over again ad nauseum until it finally stuck, destroying his chances. Think of perception again. Look at the way that they used slanted reporting to claim that Barack Hussein Obama was a post-racial president, that he would be a uniter. Yet, history shows that he has been one of the most divisive, if not arguably the most divisive and partisan presidents that we've had in living memory. And the reason that it's that way is because of a false perception. He was ushered in as some great paragon of hope and change. Remember those empty platitudes. And his followers were whipped up into that false perception. And we have suffered the consequences of it throughout the disastrous 2 terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime. It has expanded the power of the executive branch of government well beyond the proper scope and application of that office as allowed by Article 2 of the Constitution. It has essentially weakened the checks and balances that were put in place by our founding fathers to ensure that the type of despotism that we have seen wield its ugly head or rear its ugly head in the United States would never be able to occur. And it has allowed there to be a type of complacency that is set in. And that complacency has been stoked by the false narrative that created a perception of the government as benevolent. The government has our best interests in mind. But nothing could be further from the truth, because when you stop and look at exactly what they're doing, it's lying. It is an intellectually disingenuous position they have assumed. And that leads us to the current crisis that is being the hearts, souls, and minds of the true popular sovereigns in this 2016 presidential election cycle. We have been led to believe all politicians, without checking their records, are corrupt, that they are not for our best interests. Now, most aren't, but you have to check the records. Ted Cruz is not an establishment candidate. He has been vigorous in his fight against the detente wing of the gutless opposition party. Remember the way that he filibustered against the establishment, the way that he stood up for our rights, the way that he single-handedly killed the Gang of Eight bill. But you see, that type of brave stance, that consistent, courageous, conservative stance has been eroded. It has been erased because of the false narrative that is being pushed forth to besmirch him, to make him appear to be something that he's not. Again, that is part of Trump's plan. His plan to spin this web of deceit to thereby make Cruz distasteful to the base that he would normally otherwise be very popular with. And it's all part of a design. And that design is to deceive us, to pit us against one another, so that we are divided. Because if we are hopelessly divided, it means that we won't be able to approach the truth, that we won't be able to effectively mount a coalition against Hillary Clinton come the general election. And you get this perception that Trump's a fighter, but part of the erroneous nature around it, part of the intellectual disingenuousness about it, is where has he been targeting his blows? Against one of the stalwart conservatives who has stood up for our interests time and again all throughout his life. You see, what's lost in this perception that's amazing to me is when you look at the gallant stance by Ted Cruz in front of the United States Supreme Court defending our fundamental and inalienable rights. He's done so more times than any other licensed Texas attorney. He's won more times than any other licensed Texas attorney. But above all, he has stood as a stalwart and staunch defender of our rights and of our representative Republican form of government. But there's another false perception that is being peddled on social media by some of the acolytes of the Trump camp, that because it is a legal system or because it is done within our judiciary, it's not real. It's not a real experience. Oh, we all hate lawyers. Lawyers are bad, this, that, or the other. Excuse me. Well, think back to Shakespeare's famous words. First, we must kill all the lawyers. There's another false perception. You know what it really meant in the play when they come to that line? It's if you want to destabilize society, if you want to ruin society, first, you must kill all the lawyers. Now, don't get me wrong. The trial attorneys bar, all of these out-of-control slip-and-fall type lawyers, or the government type lawyers that sit there and defend the most egregious forms of tyranny and despotism and oppression, are not good attorneys. They are violating their oath of office. But therein lies the problem. Yes, all attorneys swear an oath of office to uphold and defend and promote the Constitution. But why are those who go against the Constitution, that incessantly attack the Constitution or claim that it is some quaint, antiquated document that should not be applicable in a modern society, why are they never held accountable for violating their oath? Selective enforcement, and it creates a perception. You see, perception, being the powerful tool that it is in politics, can be used to manipulate. That's what Trump is trying to do. That's what Hillary's trying to do. This whole phony baloney notion of a war on women that the Democrats try and trudge out each and every election cycle, that's a false narrative based on the hopes of designing a perception that will destroy those of us who wish to have the government strictly adhere to the tenets contained in the Constitution. It's designed to create a narrative that all of us who are constitutionalists are somehow out of touch. We're radical. We're extremists. But how could you be an extremist if you are wanting to enforce the law, to ensure that our fundamental rights and freedoms are protected? You see, that's not a radical position unless you buy into the false narrative. And you see, the perception and narrative work hand in hand. They are inseparable. And that is what the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media are trying to do. And they do it because they know just how powerful narratives are. They know that they can manipulate, and that's their goal. Because if you think back to what the Fabian socialists are, going back to their original iconography, that of a wolf in sheep's clothing, their purpose is to infiltrate society, to poison society. Because the only way that they can implement their Fabian socialist dystopia is to destroy that which came before. And that which came before is the longest uninterrupted constitutional republic that this world has known in its history. That is something they hate. And why do they hate it? Because they want control. You see, control has always been the battle, going back to the beginning of this country. The question that will be at the heart of every debate, for as long as our representative republic remains on this earth, is just how much authority should the federal government possess? How much authority should they bear over the people? Well, the answer is within the four corners of the Constitution. And that is why you see them develop this strong sense of hatred for the document, because they see it as the impediment that it was designed to be. It works against their dark and twisted machinations in which they hope to ensnare and enslave the American people. That is a dark place to be. It's a dangerous place to be. But we see that it's peddled in our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border. That they are working in a malicious fashion to indoctrinate the minds of the up-and-coming generations, and indeed those generations which have yet to be born. And again, it is all aimed at creating this Fabian socialist dystopia. And folks, they have been working towards this nonstop for well over 100 years. They are meticulous, methodical, and patient. And there is a perception that Donald Trump can't create. You see, Hillary Clinton, as my first officer Jeremy Grapington has liked to mention on past episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is a very patient woman. She's a schemer, a manipulator, vicious, cold-hearted, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Trump, on the other hand, is very impulsive. He does not have the ability to control himself. And we've seen that with many of the gaffes that he's made. But again, because there has been this false narrative perception created about him, that he stands up to political correctness, that he shoots straight from the hip, he calls things out as they are, his most ardent followers are willing to forgive him for everything. But there are moments when he speaks in front of the cameras for the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism, for the salivating mainstream media, when he lets open the truth, when he sarcastically and caustically states his true intention. One of those moments is when he said, I could shoot somebody out in Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any supporters. Why? Again, it is because of the power of perception that he has managed to create through unique media manipulation that has allowed him to push forward this drivel, that has made him a seemingly Teflon candidate. But you see, those who operate under a perception can be just as easily destroyed when another perception is created. And don't think for a minute that the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media haven't figured that out, haven't thought about that, haven't worked that into their plan. They have. They are working their backup plan right now. You see, they wanted to choose the candidate because they wanted the candidate that would be the most easily defeated by Hillary. And there is no question in my mind that Donald J. Trump, also known as John Barron, also known as would be an exceedingly easy candidate for Clinton to defeat. All you have to do is look at his consistently inconsistent positions to know that it's a disaster. Yet no one has seriously put forth the notion that he is a flip-flopper, other than those of us who haven't consumed the quaffade. No, because that again goes against the propagandistic agenda. You see, the perception here that is working against us is this idea that because of his wealth, that automatically assumes that he's a good business person. He's a good investor. I'm not so certain that he's a great business person. Trump Mortgage being started right before the financial meltdown, ultimately gone. Trump Magazine, ultimately gone. Trump Shuttle, ultimately gone. Trump Steak, ultimately gone. And that was one of the few areas where his narrative, creating this false perception, which he was using to dupe people, threatened to unravel. But he went out and instantly changed the narrative again through his vulgar style on Twitter and various other social media sources to create this lie that, well, no, Trump Steak's still here. I got it here. But it wasn't Trump Steak. It was steak that he bought somewhere else. Trump Steak is not available. Trump Shuttle is not available. But he couldn't allow there to be a perception of failure. Part of this plays into his own ego. I've never seen a candidate who has been so fragile with respect to his ego. Look at the way that he reacts to the people laughing at his hands. And that was brought up in a magazine back in the 1980s. And he still sends photographs to that man, the author, circling his hands in gold Sharpie marker, gold magic marker, saying, look, look, the beautiful hands, the great hands. These hands built a tower. I love my tower, kind of like I love the country. But I don't really love the country. I love what I can get out of the country. I love what I can get from manipulating the country. Well, that's not good. That's certainly not the type of characteristics that we want from someone who will be wielding the reins of political power in the most powerful nation in the free world. It's a dangerous con game that he's playing. This is why he is the P.T. Barnum of our era. When he said that I love the poorly educated, that was not a compliment, folks. But the media created this false perception that it was. And the most vocal, ardent followers and acolytes of Trump bought that, hook, line, and sinker. And I'm not seeing this as a form of belittlement, and I'm not saying it, as I speak into this microphone, as a form of belittlement or disparagement towards Trump's supporters. It is very easy to be manipulated by a confidence man. Con artists have been the bane of society for as long as we have come together in civilization. And this is perhaps the biggest con game ever to be perpetrated on the United States. It's playing out in real time like a major disaster. And time is running out to put an end to the madness. And we are increasingly seeing that so many have been so duped by it that they refuse to back away from it. They close their eyes to the facts. Now, that's not saying that they're dumb people. Not in the least. It's saying that they've been manipulated. That their righteous indignation, their righteous anger has been abused. Trump has been abusing his followers. And when that comes to light, it may be too late. We are approaching a precipice of destruction, the likes of which this nation hasn't seen in living memory. But due to the natural spirit, that inconquerable and indomitable spirit of the American people, the true wielders of sovereignty, I don't think that it will be the end of us as a nation and a people. So long as we come together and do our part to defend our Constitution, to promote the free exercise of our rights, and to protect one another, then there is no force powerful or big enough on earth to eradicate us. The only way that the United States of America will ever fade from this earth or ever come to its ultimate destruction is if we are the arbiter of its destruction. If we are the ones that create a type of natricide or national suicide. Because when you look at our ability to defeat all odds against us, to overcome every adversity that has been placed in our path, it is because we have this ability to come together and realize there is a greater good, that it is a greater good that we work towards in the hopes of accomplishing the true American dream. If you stop and think about it, the perception of the American dream has been turned into something that's materialistic. But in point of fact, the real American dream is the ability to exercise and enjoy our fundamental and inalienable rights without fear of governmental repercussions, and to ensure that our posterity continues to live with the same great birthright that we are the beneficiaries of. That is an integral part of what it means to be an American citizen. That is an integral part of what popular sovereignty is. But the perception that has been thrown out there by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media is that it's something less, that there's an unfairness to it all. Think back to the narrative of the Occupy Wall Street movement. That whole nonsense about the one percenters, the wealth gap, all of this. That too is a perception. A perception used to blind useful idiots, to be used as pawns by the Fabians who are marching lockstep towards their goal of destroying our representative republic and replacing it with a socialist dystopia. And you see, they have become master manipulators. And it's much easier to pull off this type of mass manipulation when you have the media on your side. And it will be interesting to see if by some cruel twist of fate that the New York billionaire, businessman, real estate tycoon, and Donald Trump manages to secure the gutless opposition party nomination, just what will happen when the salivating mainstream media turns on him in a flash. All of a sudden, the rules of the game will change. It will be a different narrative. It will be wall-to-wall coverage of all of his consistently inconsistent positions, all of his vulgar statements, all of his past gaffes, all of his past failures. It will come to flash across American television screens ad nauseum incessantly, all to create what? A perception. You see just how dangerous perceptions can be? It's a major problem. It's a major problem that is being utilized as a weapon against the popular sovereigns. And this is to the great joy of the Fabian socialists who believe in this ridiculous sort of manipulation. They see this as their glowing, shining, best opportunity to manipulate the American people, thereby ensuring that they ensnare themselves in the traps that the Fabians have set to change America for the worst. And that is what's truly despicable about our opponents. But you would think that Donald Trump would attack this, would see this, with the way that he set himself up as some sort of paragon of conservative values and virtue, that he would go out and tirelessly crusade against that false narrative and those false perceptions. But instead, he has used it as a shroud around him. He has created a mantle of it, as though that will allow him to secure power. But it leads to the question, why has he done all of this? What has he been seeking? His perception is that he's a great conservative warrior, but his past deeds, his current actions, and his selective targeting of conservatives shows him to be the exact opposite of what he's claiming right now. And that is the danger that we must be cognizant and aware of. The worst thing is, though, folks, that we haven't even seen the most egregious type of false perception that will be peddled out during this campaign. Not just this campaign, but during the general election. We've seen the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media perpetuate this nonsensical myth of the so-called Republican war on women. It's designed to create a false narrative, to then create the perception that the Republicans are out to deprive women of their reproductive rights, blah, blah, blah. We saw it in 2012, and it was used to mercilessly tear apart a candidate who didn't even want to win, a wishy-washy, spineless candidate in Mittens Romnikins. And that was not a good place to be. But it shows that the gutless opposition party has been, for the most part, powerless in combating the narrative and the perception that is being peddled by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. They buy into the perception. They attempt to become the party of Me Too. And that's what I find so damaging about what Paul Manafort said in that taped meeting with leaders of the détente wing of the gutless opposition party, when he said that what Trump is doing is just projecting an image, custom tailoring his message, whatever that might be, to a particular audience. And that we'll see the real Trump when it comes time for the general election. You see, people, that's the deception. That's the fraud. That's the hoodwink that's been in the process and in the works ever since Trump officially threw his hat into the ring last summer. It's not that he cares about conservatism. He's never held those positions in the past. He is pushing sheer populism. And populism is just to destroy that which exists. There is a populist strain to Fabian socialism, as there is to any form or facet of socialism. When you look at what Mao Zedong did in communist China with the Cultural Revolution, that was a populist type movement. But it was deceitful. And it was all to create a perception of power, strength, and infallibility of the party. Just as there has been fraud and deceit utilized in this campaign season to create this false perception that Donald Trump is not just a conservative, but a conservative of the Reagan strain. But when Reagan was president, Trump attacked him. Basically said he was out of touch, that he was crazy, that he was a kook, he was too far to the right. Again, the facts of history are what the peddlers of this nonsense don't want you to consider. They don't want you to see the truth. because they know that the truth will obliterate this false perception. And they have been working tirelessly to create it. But what it has done thus far is pit us against each other. And they are hoping that it will be used in such a way as to make enough of us stay home to throw the election for Hillary. And if you look at the way that there are so many Trump supporters who sit there and say, we would never support Ted Cruz, but you're not a conservative if you won't support Donald Trump should he get the nomination. It's a type of hypocrisy that's amazing. First of all, it's not our goal, nor is it our place to tell anyone to live their life a certain way or to vote a certain way, because voting is one of our fundamental and inalienable rights. Nobody has the right to tell us how to exercise those rights. And it's all going to come back down to a perception of truth. And that truth is that those of us who never wanted Trump, who have been warning everyone about him from the beginning, said we can't support him in good conscience. That was not a false perception. That was not a false narrative to be used to dupe people. To make us seem more powerful in an arrogant form or fashion. No, it is the truth. Because if we support him, we are submitting to the destruction of the conservative movement. Notice I said conservative movement, not the Republican Party. Parties are just tools to be used to identify who we are and the positions we hold. It's to congregate like-minded people. And the reason that we use that is so that it gives us a platform to use. But if that platform becomes useless or embraces someone who does not accept any of our hard, heartfelt positions, then that party has left us. Think back to the words of Reagan himself when he said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party, it left me. Well, we are fast approaching a point now where true constitutionalists are being faced with a similar situation. It's not that I left the Republican Party, it's that if the Republican Party will allow itself to embrace a twisted form of populism that is not based in any concrete, sound political philosophies or principles, by nominating Donald Trump, then that party has left me. That is a party which has booted me out and has left no room for me, because it is diametrically opposed to everything that I hold sacred. And I know that this is a feeling that is shared by a great many conservatives. And that is what has made this election cycle perhaps more bitter than any other in living memory. It's that we have gone after each other with such ferocity that we've lost sight of the greater good of the country, that we've lost sight of the importance of the supreme law of the land, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, is none other than the Constitution. And again, perception with perspective and the light of truth can shine through the false narratives and the false perceptions that have been foisted upon us by the salivating mainstream media, by those feckless, spineless weasels that would do anything to illicitly amass power for the federal government destroying the proper scope and application of government as mandated by the four corners of the Constitution. They are working to alienate us, to beat us down. Trump even came out and said that a vast majority of his supporters would never vote for Cruz, but that Cruz supporters would vote for him. I don't know where he got that from, because that's certainly not been the sentiment that I've gotten from Cruz supporters. It's certainly not the sentiment that I hold. Most Cruz supporters are looking for someone who will remove the chains and shackles of governmental tyranny, oppression, bondage, and servitude, so that we, the people, the true ultimate wielders of sovereignty, can come forth and do our necessary duties and obligations to save the country. Because it goes back to the point that I made in the opening part of the show, that what we've repeated time and again, while perception may be more important in politics than facts at times, the truth always comes up. And we, the people, are the true sovereigns. We are the only ones that are enabled by our fundamental and inalienable rights to save this country. That's what makes turning to a Messiah so dangerous. And there is a perception that Donald Trump has wholeheartedly embraced throughout this entire campaign cycle and season. But there's a problem. You see, he's not going to be able to maintain that perception when it comes to the general election. Hillary Clinton is frothing at the mouth to have an opportunity to go after him. His philandering, his statements against women, which are duplicitous and disgusting, will be utilized as a weapon against Donald. Now, Donald has already come out and said that he will use Clinton's past infidelities, meaning Bill Clinton's past marital unfaithfulness, against him. But remember what the old saying is, let ye who is without sin cast the first stone. Donald Trump divorced his first wife after cheating on her with his second wife, and then divorced her after cheating on her with his third wife. Hillary stayed with her husband. She took a lot of flack for that, but she stayed with him. She can say that I'm more consistent, that I stand for the values of what's important to a family, and that will create the perception that she is committed to families. It will create the perception that she is more stable than Donald. And that will seal his fate. Just as he has used false narratives and perceptions to seal the fates of most of the other opponents of his in the campaign season, and if he manages to knock off Ted Cruz, that will be how the narrative plays out. That will be the new perception that they create, and it will play out with devastating effect, thereby ensuring that Hillary Clinton has the victory. But that raises the question of, was this Donald's plan all along? Did he want to ensure that Hillary would be the next president? Because if you recall, she was a distinguished guest of honor at his third wedding to the Czech thumper. And he was golfing buddies with Bill Clinton. And in fact, he made a phone call to Clinton, I think about a few weeks before he officially threw his hat in the ring last summer. Now, does that sound like someone who is committed to conservative principles? Does someone who as recently as 2014 was giving money to tax cheat Terry McAuliffe, who is now trying to ensure that Virginia becomes a steady blue state by allowing convicted felons to vote, a conservative? You see, they try to create another false narrative in the Trump camp, that Trump is a Reaganite conservative. And It's a good comparison because Reagan was originally a Democrat. The difference is Reagan had a well-established track record of supporting conservative causes, championing the conservative message for decades before he even came near running for the White House. Not Trump. Because as late as 2014, he was supporting Terry McAuliffe. As late as 2013, he was supporting Dianne Feinstein's so-called assault weapons ban. He was the one that funded the Gang of Eight. He was the one that continued to push all of these detrimental progressive plans and agendas, which are diametrically opposed to the will of the American people. But because of the narrative and the perception that he has been able to create with the aid of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media throughout this entire campaign season, it has created one of the most god-awful types of responses, a non-response from the arguments that come up. You can say all of what there is about Trump's past position. Yeah, I don't care. Yeah, but Trump. Yeah, but Trump. And then our response, when we are pushed to this precipice, where we can see no meaningful distinction between Hillary Clinton and the Donaldov, will say, yeah, but so what? Because if there's no difference, then there is no way that I, or Jeremy, or our first Air Marshal, Nelson Ward, could ever in good conscience vote for Donald Trump. And he will fall to inevitable defeat. And it leads to another false perception that he's attempted to foist upon the Republican Party at the very least. And that is, look at all this new fresh blood that I brought into the Republican Party. All these new voters. Maybe some of them are people that were disinterested in politics before and are only being brought in by the perceived, there's that word again, perception, magnetism, and charisma of the New York vulgarian. But there are also a great many of them who are Democrats who have simply crossed over in open primary states to ensure that the candidate most easily vulnerable or susceptible to defeat by Hillary Clinton would be the eventual nominee for the gutless opposition party. It's sort of a reverse of the Operation Chaos plan that Rush created or devised back in 2008 when he told Republicans in open primaries to cross over and vote for Barack Hussein Obama because he would be the most easily defeated Democrat candidate. If that plays out the way that the Obama thing did, and Trump actually does manage, although it really does not seem likely that he would, but let's just for argument's sake manage to win in the general election, we would see a third term of Barack Hussein Obama, maybe moving at a bit of a slower pace than what Hillary Clinton did. But you'll see that the Republicans won't stand up to him. Why? Because that would create a perception, a bad perception, that the Civil War, the bad blood that occurred all throughout the primary season of this campaign has bled over into the general operations of the government. And that too would be seized upon by the salivating mainstream media to create yet another false perception, that of the same false perception that Obama has created. Oh, they're the party of obstruction. They're obstructionists. They can't even get along with each other. Look at that. Ha 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 ha. You see, they work towards that goal, towards creating that preposterous perception, because they can use it as a weapon. it gives them power that they wouldn't otherwise have. And they will use it to the greatest effect that they can to bludgeon us in election cycle after election cycle. When we say that the conservative movement is endangered by this, it is for those very reasons. It is not something that can be ignored, nor is it something that can be swept under the rug. But many of Trump's followers are approaching this as if it's not a real thing, as if conventional wisdom will apply, that we will all just vote for somebody, irrespective of how detrimental they are, irrespective of how much they have turned their back to our views, just because they have an R after their name, just because they're not a Democrat. But remember the other perception that has been reiterated ad nauseum throughout this election cycle by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. This is the election cycle where we abandon conventional wisdom. Well, if we have to abandon conventional wisdom with Trump's ascendancy, then Trump is going to have to abandon conventional wisdom with those of us just bowing down and accepting the conservative line, or a false conservative line, more accurately. But you see, even that, in and of itself, this type of bullying to create a tyranny of false unity, is also a false perception. Excuse me, folks, I'm still got a little bit of that influenza there, but it's gone now, thankfully. But if I cough every now and then, I do beg your pardon. But this false narrative, this false perception, it didn't come to fruition in 2008. McCain lost. It didn't come to fruition in 2012 because Romney lost. The common denominator between both of those candidates is that they were détente members. They pushed for the Fabian socialism of the left. They were the go-along to get-along party. And we're already hearing that Trump is about to pull that same thing too. And we've already seen it with his pivots to the left. And the pivots to the left that we're seeing with him is that he's moving on the transgender bathroom issue to say that anybody should be able to use whatever bathroom to whichever gender they identify with. But we see a backlash there too. Look at what's happened at Target. Look at the way that there is this huge boycott developing with respect to the way that they've handled this entire debacle. That's a real thing. That is something that cannot be ignored. But the salivating mainstream media wants to play the part of the Wizard of Oz story of convincing the people through another false perception that we should pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, pay no attention to Oz, the all-knowing, the mighty, the wise, and powerful. It's not going to work. It's not going to work for the same reason it didn't work in 2012 and the same reason it didn't work in 2008. We're tired of those irresponsible détente members of the gutless opposition party, or GOP, trying to dictate how our system is to work. We're tired of the media trying to select our candidates, and believe me, folks, to steal a catchphrase from the Donaldus himself, Trump is the media darling for the Republican Party. They have pushed the narratives and the false perceptions that they have in order to empower him so that they can turn against him. It's as plain as day to see for anyone who takes a step back and tries to, as much as humanly possible, remove all of the raw emotionalism that has been kicked up like a cloud of dust in this campaign season, because they are manipulative, because they are deceitful, because they don't believe what they are pushing, other than trying to deprive us of our fundamental rights. And that, in and of itself, works against everything that we hold near and dear in this great representative republic of ours. Why would we willingly submit ourselves and cast our name behind a candidate who doesn't support us? Well, that's part of the goal. Then they can say, look at how great and popular Hillary Clinton is. And the perception of the war on women will go into full swing and be used against us to devastating effect. But it won't be because of the false perception per se. It'll be because of the great fissures and divisions that have been sown within the base of the Republican Party. It will be because of the nastiness in which Trump has engaged this entire campaign, conducted himself, that we will not ever back down. And that's part of another perception. Already, those who championed him and served as an acolyte, instead of winning our support, instead of convincing us how Trump is going to be good, and believe me, that would be some difficult task, as he has not given any policy particulars, but how he would save this country. They haven't convinced us of that. But they're going to blame us and say, oh, it was that god-awful Never Trump movement. That's what defeated him. No, the only thing that defeated him was because of willful blindness, because of a small segment, yet vocal segment, of Republicans who decided to sell out their principles and foist this charlatan upon us. Will he defeat? Trump will have no one to blame for his defeat but he himself. But if you look at the way he's run his campaign, disbanding all of the infrastructure that he created in those primary and caucus states where he won, right after that, in his woefully incompetent manner of trying to secure delegates that were unbound after the fact via the congressional districts, you have to wonder if he ever even intended to win. Well, according to a former manager of one of his super PACs, he had no intention of winning. He never had any intention of winning. It was an ego move. It was designed to boost and stroke his own ego. How selfish can you get? But the problem is, the perception that is being peddled out there is that we, the true constitutionalists, those that want nothing more than to return all levels of government back to strict adherence to the fundamental tenets contained within the four corners of the Constitution, we're the radicals. We're the unbending ones. We're the ones that are the villains here. The way they are casting that, the way they are portraying that is not only intellectually disingenuous, it's right out of Saul Alinsky's playbook, Rules for Radicals. And that is the way this campaign has been conducted. But think about the strategy that Trump has used to create false perceptions. 9 times out of 10, it always comes down to projection. He is projecting his own foibles. He's projecting his own wicked and twisted ways upon everyone else. And whenever he encounters a defeat, or whenever he encounters a problem, it is never his fault. It's always everybody else's fault. Oh, it's some grand Trumpspiracy theory against him. And that creates another perception, one that a vast majority of his followers latch on to. They vocally squawk about it, vociferously protest it. And they lay the blame at everyone else when they really should be looking in the mirror. That is my honest and frank opinion about it. That is how I feel this race has played out. And it is an ugly thing to see. It is not the better angels of our nature that has been on display during this campaign season. And it has been perpetuated not only by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media, but more devastatingly by those who were once considered conservatives. But now we have to redefine it. Because if you support Donald Trump, you have sealed with the kiss of death the fate of conservatism. You have turned your back on it, and you have perpetuated these dark problems that are facing this country. Now you will have to live with the consequences of it, just as I am living with the consequences of making the decision that I have made. That's what it means to be self-accountable, to be self-responsible. But there's still time. There's still time to put an end to the madness. And that can be done by returning to the Constitution and by demanding that the government return to strict adherence thereto. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back so she can alter your perceptions with one last round of alcohol. As always, ladies and gentlemen, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to take this opportunity to personally thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. I also invite you to leave any questions or comments or concerns that you might have here at our YouTube page or our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. And I invite you to follow us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. There you will find my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my First Officer Jeremy Grapington, our Blogspot account where we give you true perceptions of reality, and our Cafe Press account where you can also utilize perception by buying beautiful shot glasses or drinking glasses with our logo on it, any type of attire and apparel. There's all sorts of choices. There's also the first class passenger logo. Create the perception of enlightenment and embrace enlightenment by supporting us. As always, folks, thank you again for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We'll see you next time. Do take care.